Well, everyone's talking about the internet they want and making very clear it's not the internet they've got. And as someone who watches this very closely and someone who goes on every day and sort of lives on it, I'm wondering how we got the internet we got if it's so far short of the internet we want. If there were some forks in the road, some turning point moments where we got one thing instead of another and that really shaped today's landscape, certainly I'd like to hear from Commissioners Powell and Hunt about that.
He wants to know what mistakes we made.
Yeah. No, I didn't say that. I didn't say that. But as you look back at it, you know, the theme of this session is supposed to be about government regulation and the future of the web, and that has a past, that topic, and you guys know about it.
Want to go first? That's a very hard question. I think that the way I would start is to say that you are always burdened by the legacy infrastructure you start with. And I think in some ways, countries can be burdened by having been extraordinarily successful in one generation of technology in which they're trying to migrate to another. I think that has been a central problem initially with the U.S.'s growth in wireless markets and ultimately faster wireless markets. And I also think it's true in the context of embedded wireline infrastructure that was built and highly optimized over great distances across the country universally for a particular kind of service and application, essentially two-way voice if it's telephone infrastructure, initially one-way video if it was cable infrastructure. And I think trying to figure out the proper ways to migrate that have been challenging. I also think that I am really not a super fan of the 1996 Act, and I think it's very easy to make it what you want to be. What it really was an extraordinarily ambiguously defined piece of legislation that was fundamentally, to my mind, not about the internet and broadband, but was fundamentally about the last chapter in the AT&T divestiture saga, and was focused much more on a rearward perception of telephone services and competition, and didn't have the foresight.
And you'd say we're still living in the shadow of the 96 Act when it comes to the web.
I think we are, and I'll let other people chime in here, but you know, it is incredibly frustrating. The Act is still written in buckets. We talk about convergence, we talk about trying to understand the interaction between these services, but if you use twisted copper wire to provide a one-way voice services, you're a telecommunications services provider and you're regulated under Title II of the United States Code. And if you use coaxial cable to provide one-way or two-way video services, you're a Title VI cable services provider and you're regulated under that code. But as we know, all of the carriers and all of the infrastructure has blurred those distinctions, but we still administer a regulatory structure that assumes their complete separation.
Reed Hunt?
Ram Shriram has
I'm
arrived.
Introduce Ram.
Would you do the introductions, or
yes,
should
I?
Ram is a very good friend of mine, a brilliant venture capitalist, and is sitting to my left, which we did in political ranking, Ram. So you'll have to be more extreme than I, which is going to be hard for you.
I think they chose the spot because they knew I was going to be late.
And no free lunch. So two huge things have happened over the last 16 years. The first is that the world collectively has gone data, and secondly, it has gone mobile. So what was really important for people in government in the time period from the early 90s until today, what has been really important is to do whatever is possible, and I want to come back to the word possible, to do whatever is possible to open the doors with respect to these trends to Schumpeterian competition, to a new entry, to massive investment, to the creation of the infrastructures and the ecology around these infrastructures that are aligned with these trends. Because if the rule of law is used against trends like these, The result is that the society and the economy finds that it's at loggerheads with the way of the world, and bad results happen. The story of Japan in a technological level all through the 90s is the use of law to fight these trends. And much of the reason for Japan's decade of stagnation, in my view, and in the view of most leaders in Japan, Susan in her brilliant speech was talking about the advances in broadband in Japan. They represent a change of mind in Japan, which actually occurred in 1998-99, where Japan said, we've been doing the wrong thing, we've been fighting these trends. So what I would say, and I won't impute this to Mike, but what I would say is it's impossible in government to have a perfect foresight, and it's in fact pretty darn difficult to even have pretty good foresight. But the effort always that ought to be made is to get aligned with the trends of technology and fundamental economics so that the rule of law is at the very minimum not opposed to them. Point number two, it's incredibly important to get beyond the absolutely useless and false dichotomy of regulation versus deregulation. So Tim in his remarks was talking about things that we don't any longer believe in. And with apologies to a Australian economist named John Quiggin, who started this particular trope, I'm just going to give you a list of things that we shouldn't believe in as we go forward. Efficient market hypothesis, privatization, the great moderation, IRAs. Those are just examples of things that we shouldn't believe in. So what should we believe in? What should we believe in? And Tim was exactly right. In terms of the fundamentals of economics, this profession is right now shaken to its core. And so when you see Akerlof and Schiller writing a book that is about psychology as their way to explain economics, you know that if you're in government and you were using economists to give you advice, you still have to use them, but you have to ask them, what in the world are they thinking today? I'm not saying that they don't have a contribution, particularly at the micro level, but it's a big problem if you're in government today to think about how to get aligned with these technological trends and to realize that a lot of the things that you believed, that I believed with fervor in the 90s, really aren't necessarily as rock solid as you thought they were. So like the President, I believe in looking forward, not looking back, and I've ducked your question, but I've tried to say a few things, which I am going to do as long as we're together here.
You're going to continue to duck my questions?
Yes.
As long as we're going to get together?
That's the plan on
man.
my side. But what I am trying to say is a few things that are on this theme of which is how do you make up your mind about governing? Because what Susan is talking about, and this is my conclusion, these are the most important things to accomplish in my view, just a personal view. We need a health net, we need an electric net, we need a democracy net, and we need an education net. Now, these four things, they need to have certain attributes that you can't find in the market today. That doesn't mean I think the government should do the job. I just mean you can't find them. Robustness, absolute ubiquitousness, coast to coast, 24/7, all people all the time. Can you imagine a health net where 25% of the people just aren't included? It makes no sense. It makes no sense in terms of economics, much less equity. And you need security. So Mike and I have talked for years about public safety. You could add that to the list too, right, Mike? And you would find that the attributes of a public safety network are exactly the same as the attributes you would need for a healthcare network. Nobody wants other people intercepting their electronic healthcare records. And nobody wants to have it be that it just didn't quite get through when you had your heart attack, right? So the attributes are the same. How do we get that? And that's what Susan was really teeing up for us. And, this is really fun because this is a wonderful group and there's all kinds of friends here. And I think collectively we would have to say, we don't exactly know how to get there, but we do know that we want to get there.
Well, thank you for that statement. I'm not sure what question I could have asked to produce it. So,
It really didn't matter.
yeah, I figured that out. Ben, earlier we heard Ms. Crawford and Tim Wu make two, I think, interesting statements. One is that the news business is going to live on the web. It was just said as if it was a fait accompli, that's that. And Tim Wu said the age of anti-regulation basically is over. We tried that, it didn't work. Everybody's ready to do something new. What did you think when you heard those things?
Well, I've done a lot of thinking about these questions myself, and I think the more things change, the more they stay the same. And if you think about what's happening in the news business with regard to technology today, what's happening is not that the history of modern news production is suddenly experiencing something unprecedented in American history. What's happening is that the 100-year accident of centralized publishing and monopoly advertising in the community is coming to an end because of changes in the marketplace and technology and user behavior. And what we have instead is this cacophonous, wonderful mess of the blogosphere, which has greatly enhanced, I think, the marketplace of ideas and made institutional journalism better for it. But we also see the things that institutional journalism built over the last 100 years, and they're equally valuable to this society. They have met needs of public goods and civic virtue that we, I think, all would like to retain. So really, in a lot of ways, we're back to where we were 200 years ago. At the time of the founding of this country, they wanted two things. They wanted a free press, and they wanted everybody to have newspapers, and so they created subsidies for publishers, and they created a postal system to deliver it everywhere at really low rates. And in some ways, the internet is just a fantastic postal system that gets everything to everybody instantly, and it's mixed with a fantastic publishing system that allows you to publish, anybody to publish instantly. And the kinds of behaviors that are resulting from that, the social production that's happening on top of that new platform is the extraordinary thing. But the infrastructure and the ideas and the public goods of news and information and the distribution network are the same. So I think we should approach this problem not from the perspective of what's new about today and what should we do about it, but from the perspective of what have we always wanted to have, and how can we retain those things using the tools that are now available to us because of new technology.
But delivery and access are often talked about in the same breath as if they're the same thing. And just because I have a street going by my house in Washington, D.C., which I do, luckily, that doesn't mean somebody gives me a car because I have a street. It means I still have to go purchase a car from a business that can exist not only to build my car, but to sell me parts when I need them and knows what's wrong when I tell them what light is going on in the dashboard. Just the access, which is, I think, widely agreed in this room, is an important thing and still a work in progress, doesn't mean that there's going to be somebody to send you something down that street. And aren't they really two separate courses of inquiry here?
I think that they are, but the point that I'm trying to reach back for in the founding days of the Republic is that they understood them as two separate things, and they subsidized both elements, both the production of content and the creation of a network of distribution. And what's different in the interim is that a commercial market emerged that produced news, and in what is largely a historical accident, advertising in newspapers and broadcasting paid for the public good of the news. But it was rather incidental to commercial business. Even though there are lots of publishers with public service values at heart, the market doesn't really care whether or not the citizens are educated and make good decisions as a result of their stewardship in the marketplace of ideas. So now, because that market issue is changing, we have to go back to our original values and decide as a society, what do we want to do to make sure that both of the elements that you just mentioned, both access and content, are once more supported in a way that produces the outcomes, the results that we want as a society.
Jessica, what's the role of government in doing just that? Or making sure that the conditions exist for that to happen?
Well, we're at a revolutionary moment when it comes to news production and news distribution. We are, before our very eyes, migrating from a model of ink and paper and regional distribution to one that involves the internet and its infinite series of networks and always-on production values. The challenge for government as we try to wrestle with how we continue to produce quality journalism and get quality journalism to people is actually, in the first instance, I think, a broadband question. If we assume that the mode for distribution in the future will be over broadband and will be over these networks, what becomes a priority for government is making sure everyone has access to those networks. And at the moment, we've really fallen short. I mean, the last set of data from the Pew Institute suggests that 55% of Americans have broadband in their homes. And when you start unpacking those numbers, you find some disturbing trends. You find that individuals in rural communities subscribe at lower rates, about 30%, 38%. And the elderly subscribe at even lower rates at about 19%, and the low income at about 25%. So that's the challenge that in the short term, government should be focused on. Because quality journalism, like so many of our other noble goals, improving healthcare, greening the economy, improving education, really can be built on the back of broadband infrastructure.
Ram Shriram, what, if any, government role should be played in setting the terms for the existence of these institutions down the road?
Just to clarify, are you asking about the newspaper question now, or you're moving? Okay, the broader question. Well, I come from a world which is very user-centric, and much of the success of Silicon Valley has been in the deregulated markets by and large. But we have greatly benefited from an open internet, which I think is one of the great things that has caused this revolution from the PC revolution to the IP networks to now all of this rich content and applications that are possible on top of the internet, which has become the de facto platform on which most of us live our daily lives now as far as information access. So given that, I think there's a dichotomy between that and the fact that the internet is moving to the wireless world and that we don't have the equivalent of the same openness and sort of this notion of any device, any application existing as we as users move from the wired world to the wireless world. We need that same sort of openness. And so what I hope for, coming and speaking here from industry, is that we continue to preserve the openness that has given us this great success in the wired world. And, the internet largely rests today on the wired world. In the wireless world, which is where the internet is moving to, and by internet I mean everything that sits on top of it, every type of application, every type of device, all of this rich media stuff that we are increasingly consuming in what we now call the real-time web, I think is something, it's almost as important as electricity. We cannot live without it. And so it's important, therefore, that from a user perspective, we need more and bigger broadband pipes. We need to preserve the openness of these things, and we need to bring the openness ethos of the internet to the wireless world. And I think if you look at some of the overseas markets, I think Japan and Korea in particular, the kinds of applications that are possible on broadband, I think we've only begun to see those here in the U.S. And in the last 12 months with the success of the iPhone and now with the Open Handset Alliance and Android and some of the newer open source-based applications that are coming out, I think you're going to see a huge revolution that could potentially be bigger than the PC revolution in terms of job creation, in terms of increasingly rich applications for consumers. And that's what excites me the most about this.
Let me jump in there, because you heard Jessica talk about access and the lack of availability in so many parts of the country and to many parts of the potential audience. And earlier it was reported in a discouraging way that we were way behind various other countries in the world in these various measurements. Well, who's waiting for who to do what? What are the pinches in the garden hose right now? What isn't happening that would change those statistics, bring us up to the world standard? Somebody must be sitting and waiting for somebody else to do something so they can do it, because there's money to be made here.
Well, if you want me to sort of frame the issues as we see it from at least a Silicon Valley perspective, and you could say that it's one sort of jaded view, but I think it's hopefully a balanced view that you hear from us. I don't think the spectrum that's available is being fully utilized. I think we have an issue in terms of wastage in frequency, time, and space. We believe that spectrum available for consumer access is rather consolidated today, and maybe that's sort of a careful speak for a duopoly that controls it. So I think innovation is somewhat constrained as a result. And there is a severe lack of unlicensed spectrum below 1 gigahertz. And even if you combine it with what's available at 2.4 and 5.8, I think you need some of it available at the lower sub 1 gigahertz to build some sort of commercially viable last mile broadband access, which is, I think, what will unleash this, what I would call the app economy. You know, there's 1 billion apps that were downloaded on the iPhones over the last 12 months. Now, you would only roughly 10 or 15% of them are paid applications today. But if you can begin to imagine a world in which, and these are young companies, every one of them have less than 10 employees. I mean, these are the kinds of jobs we want to create in this country. And these are high-paying jobs, high value, and the kinds of applications that are being created are continuously consumed every day by consumers. So if they're willing to pay 99 cents for an application, I think that's great because it creates another small business somewhere. So I'm just hoping that the last mile access issues can be resolved if we focus on these issues that I just outlined.
Go ahead, Michael Powell. What are the impediments? What are the roadblocks?
Well, I think one thing that we cannot fail to examine is, in my opinion, this country is way over-invested spectrum-wise in broadcasting. When you look at the percentage of Americans who actually receive television as an over-the-air medium and how much of the country's valuable spectrum below 1 that is being occupied by that space, it's, to my mind, very out of whack. And I think one of the things that has slowed that progress, while it is on a path to migration, recovering the spectrum from the HDTV transition, auctioning it off, putting it back into the wireless marketplace, is a positive thing, but that has been a slow and cumbersome process as a consequence of the way the DTV transition has unfolded, which has been a, almost 2-decade long process. If Americans are beginning to commit, something like 90% subscribe to cable or satellite-based television, you really have to ask yourself why so much valuable real estate is being held back under the theoretical assumption that it's being accessed.
Well, the way I understand it is that those are held back, as you say, because of legacy users for older technology who need to be protected from this transfer. The elderly, the low income, the people who are less likely.
Yeah, but just like we made the judgment in the DTV transition, finally and correctly, in my opinion, that problem is sufficiently small that you can buy out that problem, right? That's what we've essentially tried to do in DTV, which is finally back on track, and I commend current leaders for doing so. But you said, hey, subsidize those boxes, get those people off that infrastructure so we can make a transition for the betterment of the country. And I think that's been an important process. Second thing I would say, which Ram said, which is correct, when we did an evaluation of this, a huge percentage of spectrum is not used most of the time. But yet we have a model in which you allocate an entire block to someone with a sense of ownership over the whole block. But the truth to it is the way the systems work, they're more bursty than that. There are moments at time, place, and manner in which that spectrum is more than available for other uses. And the real impediment has been that technologically, we really hadn't invested and spent a lot of time figuring out how you create much more sophisticated wireless systems that could operate in that spectrum, sort of do things like sniff whether it's being occupied, retreat when it's not necessary. And I think there's been more effort put into that. Another example Reed and I have talked about is, this country for 50 years didn't invest at all in antenna research. The television receiver in a typical television hasn't been changed fundamentally in decades. We have sloppy receivers out in the system that require excess amounts of spectrum to be used properly. And putting more energy into getting that science perfected and improved has been critical. So I do agree spectrum's the key, and I think that we're on a good path, but those are some of the impediments.
I'm going to call my mother-in-law and tell her that Michael Powell wants to buy her a new TV. But Okay. Well, so maybe we can take up a collection here. Go ahead,
Well,
Ben.
I want to raise it up about to 5,000 feet and do that by saying that I think the kink in the hose is in a lot of ways about vision and about a different perspective on how we think about broadband, not as a commercial marketplace for an entertainment good, but as an infrastructure for this country. And I'll illustrate that point by telling a little story, which is that I've been in this business for about 6 years. I came to Washington. I was a young staffer on the Hill. It was my job at that time to sit in the back corner of the financial services hearings in the House and listen to Alan Greenspan educate me about the wonders of market fundamentalism. This was the height of market fundamentalism. This was the moment when all we needed to do was get out of the way and Wall Street was going to, the Dow was going to go to 50,000. And then, a couple of years later, when this theory began to get a little shaky, but before it had collapsed altogether, I was in a hearing in the House Commerce Committee. And for some of you who may have been there, you'll have to forgive my apocryphal embellishments. My memory is not exactly clear on what happened. But Ed Markey, who was then chairman, brought in telecom executives from around the world, including the CEO of a telecom company in Japan, who had just invested billions of dollars in a high-capacity fiber optic infrastructure all over Japan. And then promptly, as soon as they had done that, the government came in and said, we're going to open that infrastructure and we're going to make it into a public utility, and it's going to be different competitors are going to share those lines. And he was being questioned by some of the congressmen. A particular congressman said, I don't understand how you could have done this. Didn't you fight this tooth and nail? You just made this huge investment. This is supposed to be the free market. You just captured the market. You're about to get the huge return on your investment, and you submitted to these government regulations. Why did you do that? And there was a pause because there was an interpreter, and it took a little while for him to get the question fully. And his answer was about 5 seconds. And the interpreter said, Congressman, he says he did it for the good of the country. And what happened next was all the lobbyists in the gallery started laughing. No one was laughing on the dais where the members were sitting. They all sort of leaned back in their chairs like this. So I think that one of the things we have to think about now in this moment where these sort of absolute theories of market fundamentalism have collapsed, and we're thinking about infrastructure and recovery and investing in what's basic about this country, we need to start thinking about broadband differently, and that has to inform our decisions. And we have to stop getting caught up in the nickel and dime fights over which tiny regulation is going to change this way or that way, and we need to have a broad, bold vision for what we're going to do with the internet as infrastructure. And I think that's the key point.
Jessica, let's take a look at a place. Take a look at a place where that attempted to happen, and the Philadelphia story is now a little old, but I think it's instructive because what Mayor Street wanted to do was change the idea of what access was for and who gets it, and make it more like a utility than like buying a subscription to an expensive magazine. And he got his head handed to him. Would that happen today? Is there a different idea out there and well distributed enough that that wouldn't happen today? Or are those battles, down on the ground, zip code by census tract by zip code, still going to be fought in that way?
Well, I think that the municipalities that sought to develop municipal wireless service in order to enhance universal access to broadband facilities, I think they had good ideas. I think there are some success stories, but it takes a certain amount of funding and competence and commitment to ensure that that actually succeeds. I think the good news going forward is that we are at a moment where we are about to right the ship. We have made significant changes during the last several months in our approach to this policy. A prominent feature of the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act is the $7.2 billion that was set aside for broadband grants. That sounds like a lot of money, but charitably, it's merely a down payment on the problem that we have. Still, it's a way to start, and it's a way to fund projects and hopefully learn something from that exercise that will inform us going forward. We have funds set aside to map the availability in broadband in every corner of this country so that we can target our policies to areas that are truly troubling and may need government assistance. And then finally, we have tasked the FCC at long last to develop a national broadband plan, which is something that nearly all other industrialized countries have, and it is high time that we develop one. So I think what's important now is we are gathering from all of these past experiences, some of them at the municipal level, some of them at the national level, and collecting the kind of data and information that will allow us to start managing this problem.
Go ahead, and then let's just go right down the panel.
Just one quick criticism of the way I think something's rolling out with respect to national broadband policy, which I am an enormous supporter of. I think one of the things you'll find in those countries, which is correct and is still wrong here, is this shouldn't be the FCC. National broadband policy should be in the office of the president. Because if you really conceptualize broadband with all its ambitions and all its potential, it is a cornerstone set of tools and assets for the solving of America's greatest problem. Broadband is healthcare. Broadband is education. Broadband is immigration policy. It's all the things that Reed outlined. And I think one of the biggest mistakes that has occurred in the United States is that the idea of what the nation's direction should be on broadband policy can come out of one independent regulatory agency that has a severe amount of regulatory restraint in terms of the authority that's granted to it. It does not have the ability to appropriate funds or subsidize infrastructure unless specifically granted, of which currently there is none. It can't access the organs of the presidency and the promulgation of its policy. I think that the Bush administration did fail in that the president and the White House never committed to the broadband policy, and I am much more encouraged that the current president speaks of it. But I do think that the policy for the country being developed inside a regulatory agency is fundamentally a mistake and ultimately doesn't get at the bigger and broader ambitions and will tend to collapse into the subsidiary regulatory issues that inform this, like universal service reform, et cetera, which are things to which the FCC really has the ability to access.
Reed Hundt, isn't that something of an accident of history because of the companies that were the early distributors of this service and because of the means that they used to distribute it, that it ended up with the FCC rather than being handled in some other way?
Well, the FCC was created as part of the Roosevelt response to the Great Depression, and the purpose of the FCC was to ensure that monopolies would be economically viable. That's the historic purpose of the FCC. That's what it was created to do in 1930, so that there would be one telephone network that would be economically viable and that it would extend its reach person by person until eventually it would be 100% of the country. When broadcast came along, the purpose of the FCC was to have a few number of licenses in every town so that this adventurous new technology wouldn't fall flat on its face. And so it was designed to create oligopoly and not diversity of a point of view or anything like that. So all of that debate comes much, much later in the history of the FCC and is, in a sense, grafted onto an organization that was created with the opposite DNA. So, so where are we now? I agree with Henry Ford, apparently the only surviving Ford car company in America. I agree with Henry Ford that in these respects, history is bunk. The important thing is to look forward and to take the point that Mike is making, the point that Jessica has made, and say, okay, what do we do now? What do we do? So to your point about let's think big, in my view, the biggest single impact on the future of communications in America, clearly, it consists of the choices made at the Department of Commerce and the Department of Agriculture about the spending of this prodigious amount of money on broadband stimulus. Couple of myths. Myth number one, it's not that much money. That's completely wrong. It's not very much money if all $7 billion is divided into tiny little grants that have no coordinated purpose and they're just cats and dogs scraps that are thrown out there. But if it is that there's a overall plan, and I don't mean that the government picks technology, but an overall plan in terms of the objectives, and if the problem that's addressed is the financing problem, This is more than enough money to completely alter the structure of broadband in America for 50 years. If the $7 billion, for example, were used to guarantee loans, it would guarantee $70 billion of loans, because that's congressional scoring. That's the way all the loan guarantees work. And $70 billion of loans on a 50-50 equity basis means $140 billion of new capital expenditure. There is no limit. If you chose that technique, there is no limit to the wonders that could be accomplished. So the choices that are made in the next 60 days about how the broadband stimulus money is dispersed are absolutely critical. From my perspective, for example, just another topic, none of it should be spent on anything unless that thing is economically viable. But if you chose to have it be that you were only stimulating 6 months or 2 years of consumer expenditure and weren't trying to establish anything structurally, you could get that result. And 2 years from now, you would have stimulated the consumer expenditure, and that would be good relative to the economy in the short term, but you would have accomplished nothing structurally. So the one thing I would say is everything depends on what you all in this room decide are the right design principles. What Susan said right here, tell us on June 8th. Didn't she say that? Tell us on June 8th. You know, it's incredibly important that wise decisions be made. And in my view, the entire shape of broadband in the United States can be changed for the century if wise decisions are made.
Ram, you heard Commissioner Hunt give a thumbnail history of the Federal Radio Commission, and yes, it did help become a petri dish for monopolies, but it also wrote rules of the road so that if you were on 640 AM in Pittsburgh, 3 other people couldn't decide they were going to be on 640 AM Pittsburgh and just crank it up and blow you out. It created a map, it created a series of technologies and regulated those, effective radiated power, number of hertz at which you could broadcast, and so on. And I think the business over time found that useful. Sometimes an impediment, but often useful. How should government be involved in this next step? You earlier talked about flourishing in a non-regulated environment, but does there have to be a sort of overall referee, umpire, guy or gal who draws the maps?
Yes, when I said that, I didn't mean to imply that the FCC doesn't have a role. What I meant to say was that much of the success of Silicon Valley had been built on unregulated markets. I think in the area of spectrum management, there does need to be an FCC, and there does need to be a very useful role that it can play, a constructive role, which it largely has. I think the important issue of our time, at least speaking on behalf of users, the users that we see, are simply that there is a great demand for low-cost broadband access. And I think the flat data rate plans have done wonders in terms of usage. If you looked at just the last 12 months, the combination of that plus the availability of new devices and new applications have started us down the road of users expecting to consume lots of information and data wirelessly. So I think the next phase of this is how do we make sure that there is A, efficient spectrum use, and B, that there is a good inventory of what's available, who has what, for how long have they had it, is it in use or not, so that we don't have anybody trying to quote-unquote corner the market, as it were. And I think that would be, since it is a national renewable resource, spectrum, I think it needs to be husbanded carefully so that everyone has access to it. And to the extent that everyone who has access to it needs to also be commercially viable, I think there is a useful role of making sure that those that do get that access can continue to make sure that devices can function on those networks and the networks are up and running all the time and so forth. Yes, I think it's a very important role, but it's not one that requires over-regulation either. And by over-regulation, I'm not, all I'm saying is let us not say that, for example, in the white spaces area where there has been a unanimous vote, I look forward to the day, hopefully in the not too distant future, where we are able to begin to have the right sort of arbitration go on about what other devices interfere in that area, and can we find a way to make sure those voices don't get heard so loudly that it works against the better good of many, the needs of a few. So those sorts of things. And I think the FCC does need to play a role in that.
Now, the regulatory momentum of the last 30 years has been away from making it possible to get kicked off spectrum. Possession became 9/10 of the law. Losing a license was almost impossible. Once you were squatting somewhere, you were there in perpetuity unless something outrageous happened. That regulatory framework that you were just talking about, would that involve maximalization of use and sometimes kicking off players who weren't living up to that?
Well, I guess what I'm implying is specifically there needs to be sort of a usage filter that says people that have either paid a lot and bought spectrum or people that aim to continue to hold on to what they've had, and technology has moved on, and so there's newer and newer applications and uses coming up. And yes, there may be a small set of users who are still using it in particular parts of the country, and if you look at TV white space as an example. So in the other case where people have bought spectrum and not used it, so if there is a usage filter, at least you could begin to understand if somebody doesn't use it for 5-10 years and they have the ability to build a network and use it, but they've chosen not to use it, is there another way to deal with that? And I think that's an important thing that the FCC ought to look into.
Because right now, if you buy a lot that's zoned residential and you don't build a house on it, they still tax you like there's a house on it. And maybe that could be something... this is not against any one industry or any one group or anything. I'm just thinking of what is the greater good theory that could be applied here that works to the advantage of the users at large. Because we got started a little late and I'm running close to the end of my time, I'd like to hear you all talk a little bit about concentration. Now, for many years, this was the monster that was going to come kill me in my sleep. Everybody and many of you in this room wrung your hands about it and pulled your hair out about it. And those concentrated players are now firing their employees left and right, trading for 10% of their old share value, going bankrupt, pulling back services. Is concentration no longer the boogeyman that it was not all that long ago, Ben Scott? And what's going to emerge in a place of the hyper-concentrated media?
Well, first, Ray, let me thank you for, and on behalf of those who fought those fights, thank you for acknowledging that we were right. It turns out that concentrated media properties that disinvest in journalism and public service in favor of ever-increasing quarterly returns is not only bad public policy and bad for democracy, also bad business. Who knew? Is the problem gone? I would say no. The problem is changing. As the market changes, the points of control over the media system change. But there always are going to be commercial motivations to try to gain control over access to communications networks and the distribution of content. The internet, unlike any technology before it, defies those restrictions. It is by its nature a many-to-many communications media. But I'll echo Commissioner Copps here, who pointed out that the stories of the death of traditional media are much exaggerated. Certainly they are in a different position than they were 10 years ago, but people still use traditional media fundamentally, and that still is a huge part of our media system. So I don't think the problem of consolidation is gone. I think it is changing. I think we need to recognize the logic of consolidation of the 1990s in broadcasting and cable is still resonant, is still the impacts of it we're still living with, but that logic is now moving into the telecommunications arena. Ron pointed out the concentration in the wireless market for broadband distribution. The same concentration exists in the wireline market. That's the future of the internet we're talking about there. And I think what we ought to do is be learning the lessons of consolidation in broadcasting and cable and thinking about it right now as we're building the future of the internet so we don't make the same mistake again.
Jessica?
Well, the last time that the Congress actually spoke on this issue was almost a year ago to the date, on May 15th last year, when the Senate voted on SJ Res 28, which was a resolution of disapproval of the FCC's last efforts to roll back some of its cross-ownership rules. But what's more striking to me is last week, in the Senate Commerce Committee, we held a hearing on the future of journalism. And we had a range of experts on the panel, from new media types to old media types, and a bunch of big thinkers. We had a vigorous conversation, but what was very striking was neither the new media types nor the old media types nor our designated big thinkers brought this issue up. And that the dialogue about how we produce quality news going forward in an internet age seems to have evolved. Neither the business industry nor the public policy experts look to this issue as being the savior. And that's not to say that it's not important, but I think it's important to note that it's actually not front and center in the debate we're having right now, at least in the Congress, about how we inspire quality journalism in the digital age that is unfolding before us.
Why did that happen, Michael Powell?
The
Evolution of the dialogue around this, because during your time as on the commission, this was portrayed as sort of the end of the world.
Oh, I know. I have the scars on my back to prove. First of all, I think there are a lot of people changing views. Nancy Pelosi 3 weeks ago also wrote to the Attorney General and said you ought to have looser antitrust policy in order to save the newspapers. Something I would have never expected coming from her or the Attorney General suggesting that might be right.
You and me both.
Well, I know. We have this in common.
But her district is in a city of 800,000
Absolutely.
people that may end up with no newspapers.
But I think what Jessica's saying, which I agree with, is I think there's a maturing understanding that what's going on, particularly when you focus on the newspaper industry, is deeper, more secular, more dramatic, more fundamental than just these issues. This is truly revolutionary transformation that's beginning to show cracks and consequences that cause worry that is commonly shared by, I think, most people. And I think that when we tackle issues of quality journalism, we should really be sophisticated in divorcing the need for our democracy to have professional journalists versus the model that will sustain them. I think we collapse too easily that journalist or quality journalist equals newspaper. I think the society is the poorer if we don't find ways to sustain and for your children to go to school, for you to pursue the profession with all the hallmarks that professionals have, training, interest, commitment, investigative zeal. If that's lost in our society, I think we'll be in a very serious place, all of which I don't think is easily replaced by the internet. Now, the real question is, what is the model and the platform that's going to allow a professional class or high-quality class of journalism to survive? That may or may not be the newspaper model, but let's be careful not to blur them together as if saving one is the functional equivalent of the other.
Well, right now, and I think it came up during that hearing, the people who blithely say, well, we'll just migrate from here over to here, don't answer the question, okay, but if you move from something that somebody buys to something that nobody buys, how do you keep paying for the fundamental core product, the information that's generated, the information that's ferreted out, and then processed, mediated by someone who knows how into something that can be consumed? It'll be great to have a web where all these news outlets live on the web and have no reporters. You know?
Let me offer a comment from the perspective of having spent 19 years as an antitrust lawyer, for whatever that's worth. In my view, all pre-internet businesses who depend on distribution for their market power are doomed by the internet. So that's true for car dealers and newspapers and local broadcast and numerous other business models. Now, I agree with Speaker Pelosi. It doesn't make any sense to say that the same person can't own the Oakland Tribune and the San Francisco Chronicle. The question today is whether anyone wants to own either of those, because their business model depended on physical distribution. Now, the fact that those pre-internet businesses gained monopoly power on that business model and that business model is wrecked, that's nothing to feel bad about. That's nothing to feel bad about. What we need to be concerned about is to make sure that there is a way for news to be gathered and to be disseminated. But from my perspective, government should have nothing to do with journalism. Absolutely, completely, totally, nothing to do with journalism. Journalism. With the business of writing about government, we don't want a government that's concerned with the business of writing about government. Government should have nothing to do with retail. It shouldn't even own banks. I'm an outlier in that respect, apparently. Government should not be in these businesses, but government ought to be in the infrastructure business and guaranteeing that there is a complete coast-to-coast, wholesale, open access network on which the new journalism can thrive.
Ram Shriram, final thoughts?
Yeah, I have to agree with Jessica and Michael with respect to the worry about quality journalism when new media takes over. I think it's a genuine concern because bloggers doesn't equal substantial journalism in the same way, where you have verifiable news and news provided with, sort of more physical presence. It's different if a blogger is sitting here writing about the war in Afghanistan versus someone who's physically there covering it, which of course costs real money and real dollars. So when that news gets disseminated over new media, if people don't pay for it, there's no way to pay for that journalist, and that's important. And it's a problem that we are concerned about as an industry, and one that we don't have a solution for today, but believe me, there are enough new models being tried, and hopefully something will emerge in this sort of dislocation process. One of the new models that just this last week that was announced and is being tried, which may or may not succeed, is the Kindle DX, and the fact that newspapers are now offering subscription through the Kindle for subscribers. The problem is, I think Amazon is still taking a larger share of that. So is that enough money to pay for quality journalism? So those questions will remain as we go through this transition to a new way of consuming that information. We still need good journalism. Separately, I would say the internet has spawned some of the greatest successes in terms of companies, and they happen to be all American businesses. So we lead the world in innovative internet-based businesses, and that's a good thing. And that was possible because of choice, openness, the fact that there's a massive amount of innovation coming out of U.S. universities and research institutions. All these are good things, and if we want to preserve this going forward, we need to continue to have an open access-based sort of wireline and wireless internet, because we should be proud of the fact, and we should take credit for the fact that our most successful technology businesses are very much leaders, not just here, but in Western Europe, in Japan, in Asia, everywhere else. There aren't other proxies in those countries that resemble these successful U.S. businesses, because they are global businesses. And I think that's something we want to cherish and grow, and if we truly believe that's the future of jobs and opportunity, then I think let's make sure that we preserve that infrastructure and make sure that enough new companies and new businesses that are probably in some garage somewhere that we haven't heard of, which could be the next Google. I'm not worried about the current Google. I'm worried about the next Google. Let's make sure that we make that same opportunity possible for them that was possible for these companies that we've spawned over the last decade.
Well, thanks a lot. I'm going to go do something very quaint. I'm going to go shoot a television story now, which is going to be on over the airwave broadcast tonight, and I urge you all to watch. But if you miss it, it'll be on the web. Thanks a lot.